Welcome back to Read It Bob. So there is kind of a criticism of the Book of Mormon, and I have seen this on a web page before on the internet, and I actually was in a debate with one of my friends, Andrew Harrison, on the Gospel Truth channel, and he actually brought this up in the debate as one of his arguments, kind of against the Book of Mormon in kind of as part of his arguments. It was a debate on the fall, but he mentioned this. And so I just wanted to respond to this criticism and give an explanation, because it's really basically just a misunderstanding of what the Book of Mormon is saying, because one, it is a hypercritical reading of the text, and two, it's just a misunderstanding and something that we, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as believers that in the Book of Mormon as scripture, we don't read it this way and see what they're trying to make the text say. So basically, I guess it would make more sense if I explain the criticism. So the criticism is this passage, these couple of scriptures I'm about to read, out of 2 Nephi 2, they claim that these verses, 2 Nephi 2, 11 through 13, that these verses suggest that for God to exist, sin has to exist. That basically, that in other words, God's existence is contingent on sin. And they say that is what these verses are teaching, and that they claim it's perverse and it is a distortion of Christianity, and that it's evil and wrong and blasphemous, and whatever else they can throw in there to try to bash the teachings of the Book of Mormon. But the issue is that that's not what this is teaching. And so I would like to read these and explain what is going on here, and basically to explain, give another scenario in which this would make sense. So basically, this is Lehi teaching, and he's talking to his son, Joseph, I believe, in particular. Yes, or is it Jacob? Jacob, sorry. He's speaking to Jacob in particular, but it's also to all his boys in a way. But what he's doing here is he is trying to make a logical point, and these critics of the Book of Mormon, they're not understanding this logical argument that he's trying to make, and they're twisting it. I would hopefully unintentionally, but sometimes critics of the church and of the Book of Mormon intentionally misunderstand things, or intentionally don't look at the whole picture in order to make something look worse than it is. So let me go ahead and read these and explain where they're getting this wrong and what this is actually meaning. Okay, so he says, for it must needs be that there is an opposition in all things. If not, my firstborn in the wilderness, righteousness could not be brought to pass, neither wickedness, neither holiness nor misery, neither good nor bad. Wherefore all things must be a compound in one. Wherefore, if it should be one body, it must needs remain as dead, having no life, neither death, nor incorruption, nor corruption, nor incorruption, happiness nor misery, neither sense nor sensibility. Wherefore it must needs have been created for a thing of naught. Wherefore there would have been no purpose in the end of its creation. Wherefore, this thing must needs destroy the wisdom of God and his eternal purposes, and also the power and the mercy and the justice of God. And if ye shall say there is no law, ye shall say there is no sin. And if ye shall say there is no sin, ye shall say there is no righteousness. And if there be no righteousness, there be no happiness. If there be no righteousness nor happiness, there be no punishment nor misery. And if these things are not, there is no God. And if there is no God, we are not, neither the earth. For there could have been no creation of things, neither to act nor to be acted upon. Wherefore all things must have vanished away. And now, my sons, I speak unto you these things for your profit. Well, I'll stop there, because 14 is part of my explanation. But, okay, so basically in 11 through 13, you can kind of see where they're going wrong here, or where they're misunderstanding here, right? Because the weird thing to maybe classic Christian, or more specifically Protestant ears, would be the whole, wherefore this thing must needs destroy the wisdom of God and his eternal purposes, and also the power and the mercy and the justice of God. So they take that and they say, oh, well, if that destroys the power of God, right? And in 13, if these things aren't, then there is no God. Then clearly what it's saying here is God is contingent on sin, because it says if there's no law, there's no sin. And so sin is part of this chain. And so if there's no sin, there's no God, right? And if there's no sin, then there's no power of God, and everything about God is destroyed, right? That's how they're understanding this verse, and they're clearly misunderstanding it, because, again, like I was saying before, this is a logical argument that Lehi is making to help his sons understand a certain point, right? And in 14, this is kind of explains itself, right? Because in 13 it says, hey, if there's no law, then there's no sin. If there's no sin, there's no righteousness. If there's no righteousness, there's no happiness. If there's no righteousness nor happiness, there's no punishment or misery. And if these things are not, there is no God, right? And he says, if there's no God, then there's no creation, so we're not here, right? Because God, he created us, he put us here, right? So 14 rounds the whole argument out. So if you don't read it, then you miss the gist of this understanding, right? So 14, and now, my sons, I speak unto you these things for your profit and learning. For there is a God, and he hath created all things both in heaven and earth, and all things that in them are, both things to act and things to be acted upon, right? So it's a logical argument saying, because he ends it with, there is a God, right? So there's a couple, there's maybe one other or two other things in the Book of Mormon that also the same people who have an issue with this have, and that's where it says God would cease to be God. Again, I can make a video about that, but those are, it's a logical argument, right? So it's not saying that there is no God, or that God ceases to be God, right? It's using logic to say, well, if it was like this, right, then there would have to, it would be there is no God, right? But there is a God, so it's not like that. That's what's going on here. Hopefully it makes sense, and I'm about to explain it more. Okay, so Lehi here is trying to teach them that there's opposition in all things, right? Basically, as if you read the rest of this chapter into the end, it's we have agency. We have to choose, right? There's opposition. There's the devil, and there's captivity and death, or there's life through the great mediator of all men, through Christ. So there's this opposition in all things, right? So right here in 13, you see he's saying, okay, well, if you can't say there's no law. If you say there's no law, then there's no sin and there's no righteousness, right? And so basically, you see the logical argument forming here, right? So people, especially in modern day, they say, well, there's no God giving us commandments. Like, commandments aren't a thing. There's nothing that God expects of us, right? There's no set agenda that God has for us, or there's no law of Christ, there's no doctrine of Christ, there's no gospel. So they say this, and so basically he's saying to his children, you can't say that, because if you say that, then there's no sin. And if there's no sin, then there's no righteousness, right? And so you can see this forming where he's walking down a logical conclusion saying, if you say that there's no commandments, and that there's then you're saying there's no good, there's no bad, right? And he walks down and says, well, then that would get rid of happiness, right? Because if there's no good, there's no bad, then how can you be happy or sad? Or how can you, he's walking this down and saying, logically, if all these things aren't there, then there would be no God, right? And why? Because where there is God, there is happiness. Where there is God, there is righteousness. Where there is God, he has set forth a law, right, for us to obey. He set forth commandments, right? Believe in and have faith in Christ, right? There's commandments. There's things that God has set for us. And when you break those commandments, there's sin. When you keep them, there's righteousness, right? So basically, what he's doing here is he's using this logical argument, and he's saying, if you say there's all these things, then logically there'd be no God. And if there's no God, then we don't exist. But we exist, right? There is a God. So therefore, you have to say there's something called righteousness. You have to say there's something called sin, right? Because there's a law. So you have to keep the law, and you need to be righteous, because that's what God, who created us and loves us, tells us to do, right? You have to choose Christ over the devil, or you're not going to be saved, right? This is basically what he's saying. And so, again, hopefully this is making sense, but that's the answer to this whole issue. It's or this question. It's not saying God is contingent on sin. It's saying that these other things are contingent on God, right? A law. It's contingent on God giving us a law. If God didn't give us a law, there would be no law, right? And righteousness is contingent on God, right? God sets forth the law, and then when you obey the law, that is righteousness, and when you reject the law, that is sin, right? Again, God isn't dependent on happiness, but happiness is dependent on God, right? So there's kind of like a metaphor or an example I like to give, and that kind of could help other Christians and people who would have an issue with these verses. And again, I believe they only have an issue with these because they're doing a hypercritical reading of the Book of Mormon in order to find something to have an issue with, right? Because Latter-day Saints don't believe that God's existence is contingent on sin, right? We don't believe that. So the example is, if you're talking to an atheist, right? And there's a Christian, he's talking to the atheist, and they're talking, and the Christian, as Christians, apologists usually do when they're speaking to atheists, that he's pointing out, the Christian points out, well, you can't say what's right or wrong because you don't have a base for morality, right? If you say there's no God, then there's no base for morality, right? You can't say there's no right or wrong, right? If you say, if you say there's no God, then there's no truth, right? So if there's no God, there's no truth, because truth is dependent on God, right? So, but in that discussion, if the atheist just says, okay, well, then there's no truth, right? Well, then the Christian could say, okay, well, if there's no truth, then there must be no God, because where there's God, there is truth. And if there's no God, then there's no creation. If there's no creation, then we're not there, right? That I could actually see that happening in a YouTube video somewhere. You know what I mean? It's something you could picture, because these types of conversations happen all the time between Christian apologists and atheists, right? And so if someone's like, oh, well, there is no absolute truth. Well, then the Christian guy again says, okay, well, then there must not be a God. If there's no God, there's no creation, and we're not here, right? So he's using the logical argument. But we are here, right? And there is a God. And because there is a God, there is truth, because truth is dependent on God. So in the same way, this is what Lehi is doing here, right? So if you say there's no law, then there's no sin, there's no righteousness, there's no happiness, there's no punishment, there's no misery, right? And if all these things aren't, well, then there is no God, right? And if there's no God, there's no creation. And then he's like, but I'm telling you these things because for your profit, because there is a God, right? And because there's a God, all these things are. You can't say that they're not here, because they are here, because they're dependent on God. So you go back through the list, there is a law, right? There's sin, there's righteousness, there's happiness, there's punishment, and there's misery, right? So it's a logical argument that a hypercritical reading of the text can misunderstand. But this isn't teaching that God is dependent on or contingent on sin. Rather, it's teaching that these things are contingent on God. So because we believe in God, and because there is a God, there are these things, and we can't fight against them. We can't just assume or try to say these things don't exist. We can't, that's what the modern world does. They say, well, there is no sin, right? Go to Alma chapter 30, right? Well, there is no sin. You can do whatever you want. Whatever a man does, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Well, you can't do that, right? You can't say that, because there is a God. So there is a law that God sets forth. There's commandments, right? And if they're kept, there's righteousness. If they're broken, there's sin. Like, these things exist because God exists. So hopefully that answers the question. Leave me any comments if there's any confusion or anything like that. Any questions I can answer. But it was just something that I saw that I'm like, why is this even an issue? And again, it's because it's a hypercritical reading of the text. This isn't something that LDS people believe, and I think it's interesting that they try to go into the Book of Mormon and pull out things that we would never pull out when we read them. So, yeah.